In this screencast, we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of homeostasis. And remember that we've defined homeostasis as maintaining a dynamic state of equilibrium. Ever-changing conditions externally are going to be regulated internally. And so this process of homeostasis allows us to do that. So we've seen in many different examples, from the cellular level to the system level and to the organism level, to the body level, how our body continuously makes small adjustments to create internal balance, even though external conditions are changing all the time. And it's really important to know that homeostasis occurs in all living systems. All living systems eventually stop living. Things die because their inability to maintain that balance. Now, a lot of things can lead to that, a lot of diseases and illnesses and accidents and stuff, but it is the inability to maintain homeostasis. So all living things are going to maintain this balance. An example are what are called stomata or stomates, and those are essentially just openings in typically the underside of a leaf that allow for gas exchange to take place. And plants typically need to maintain a regulated level of gases, which include oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as water vapor. So there needs to be exchange between the plant tissues and the atmosphere. So there needs to be a number of things together to maintain homeostasis. One, an organism needs to be able to sense the changes. And of course, your nervous system and all of your senses. But going beyond that, there's internal sensors that need to be able to change or be able to detect changes. Of course, then your control center is going to be like the processing of that. So somewhere in your brain or central nervous system, a body is going to sense the changes, but yet then know how to respond to those changes. So mostly the nervous system and the endocrine system, which regulates basically chemicals in the body, namely chemicals called hormones, but they respond to the changes. And we've looked at these in lab, physiological responses, which are really automatic things, versus behavioral, which are, for the most part, we think about almost voluntary responses, like you decide to put a jacket on when you feel cold. But some of them are automatic. Actually, even shivering or goosebumps or some other things that are not directly observable would be behavioral responses as well. The way that your body systems work together to maintain balance for you, and again, we're going to center on humans, of course, but this occurs in all types of organisms, and all organisms from plants to animals, and even single-celled bacteria, etc. Somehow, at some level, they need to take care of this balance. And it doesn't work. Your homeostatic mechanisms or ways of dealing with the environment is not really that different than a home thermostat and temperature control system. You have a set point. That's something you would put into the thermostat at home. I'd like it in the cool months, winter months, to keep it about 70 degrees. My wife likes it at, 86.2 degrees inside. But you can control that. But then there's going to be input to that thermostat, and that's actually going to kick on or off a heater in response. So your heater or the furnace in the house is going to get that signal. It's going to, let's say, turn on, and that's going to produce the response. Well, the response is going to increase the temperature of the room to a certain point. And at that certain point, when the temperature reaches the set point again, then the next step would be to shut off that process. So it's really kind of a cyclic process if you think about it in home heating, but it's much like the body would regulate. So there's two ways of responding to external changes, and they're called feedback systems. feedback, and there's two to know. One would be negative feedback, and it's important to know that negative does not mean bad or does not mean harmful. It really just means opposite, as in an opposite direction. So exactly what we just talked about with a heat and thermostat. If the temperature gets too high, there's going to be some action either to turn off the furnace or even maybe kick in an air conditioning, but it's corrective. So negative feedback is all about correction. Positive feedback is a little bit rarer, actually. Most all feedback mechanisms are negative because they are corrective, but a positive feedback system is actually going to adjust the conditions to increase the initial change. And this is kind of like setting your cruise control at 55, of course, and then actually stepping on the gas. By stepping on the gas, you are increasing your set point. So we talked about temperature, and you looked at temperature in a lab as well. But here's another example that dealing with blood sugar. And you don't need to know all of this, all the details here, but basically, if high blood sugar, glucose as a sugar, is detected, then the cells that are in your pancreas are going to secrete insulin. And essentially what insulin is going to do is it's going to, long story short, it's going to regulate the blood sugar levels. So if the blood sugar levels increase, the corrective response is to decrease the blood levels. It's really important to note that negative feedback is not like taking your foot off the gas, for an analogy of driving a car. A negative feedback is always very active. It's like going a certain speed in a car, but actively stepping on the brake. If you're driving, just kind of using driving in multiple analogies here, if you were driving down the road and the car, for some reason, starts to veer off the road to the right onto the shoulder, you have to actively turn back to the left. You can't just take your hands off the wheel and expect the car to correct itself. Well, that's what negative feedback is all about. It's about corrective mechanisms. Probably the best positive feedback example is one that saves your life all the time, and that would be blood clotting. If you break a blood vessel, maybe you get hit with a softball in the thigh, or you actually cut your hand with a scissors. There's a lot of chemical reactions that take place in the blood, but the clotting sequence begins, and as you build up more and more clots, more and more chemicals to produce more and more clotting occurs. So actually, the blood clotting process is increased over time. So you get more and more and more clotting, which is good because that's going to heal up the injury in the first place. Another example of this would be in childbirth. More contractions put more pressure on the cervix, and more pressure on that is going to increase more and more contractions, and that's going to increase more pressure in the uterus, and et cetera, until a child is born. And ripening of fruit. Ripening of fruit is another example. Here's my apple tree, and actually apples, for instance, the chemicals in them are going to increase their ripeness, and that actually will signal more and more ripening throughout the entire plant. So we need to really focus for regulating homeostasis, regulate two main systems. The nervous system takes care of really detection and coordination and then response. And the endocrine system is more of a chemical response, essentially through hormones and releases of neurotransmitters, other chemicals that are in the brain, etc., to respond to changes in the environment. A homeostasis example, another one in the body, is oxygen exchange. Every single cell in the body needs oxygen, and the oxygen is going to be inhaled into the lungs, and gets in the lungs, it's going to go to every cell in the body via the bloodstream. Then, once the cell has used its oxygen, in cellular respiration it's called, it's going to get rid of carbon dioxide back into the bloodstream, and it's going to be carried back to the lungs, and eventually you will breathe that out. But there's a constant homeostatic mechanism. If you don't believe that there needs to be a balance, go ahead and try to hold your breath for about 10-11 minutes, see what happens. And that's probably long enough. So, again, I hope that you learned a little bit about what homeostasis is, and especially what this was really about was understanding the mechanisms of homeostasis and regulating balance, whether they are either positive mechanisms or negative mechanisms. And remember that negative feedback is really a correction. The correction is the opposite direction of the imbalance.